Welcome back to the story of. I have nothing interesting to report about my life. I'm always so busy, but there's nothing interesting. So, I'm just gonna jump right into it. This episode, we're talking about the king of cocaine, baby, Pablo Escobar. Ever heard of him? He was known throughout Colombia as El Patron, which means the boss. He was the leader of the Medellin cartel, which was a super powerful and well-resourced drug trafficking cartel in Colombia. His full name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, and he was born December 1st of 1949 in Colombia. He had 6 siblings, and they grew up in Medellin, Colombia. He grew up in a lowly social class. His mom was a teacher, and his dad was a small-time farmer. And before Pablo was 17 years old, he stopped going to school. But then 2 years later, he went back with his cousin Gustavo Gaviria, and the teachers just didn't have a real high opinion of them. They kind of viewed them as gangster bullies, quote unquote. And after a year or so, they both just dropped out and said, screw it, we're not going to school anymore. And that began Pablo's long life of crime. He started by forging high school diplomas and falsifying report cards. But then he started clean his act up a little bit because he wanted to go to college. He wanted to become a criminal lawyer and politician. And one day, he wanted to be the president. That was his goal. But his family couldn't afford to send him to school, and so he had to stop going. And so, have you ever heard that song? I might sell drugs. Oh, how does it go? Well, who is it by? It's called Drugs by the Philharmonic. I'm not going to play it on here, but you should go listen to it, because if this story has a theme song, that's it. That would be it. So after he quit college, he went back to his life of crime. He and his brother would steal tombstones. I wonder whose idea this was. I wonder what they were doing when they're like, let's steal tombstones. We can sand off the engraving and we'll just resell them as new tombstones. And that's what they did. I don't know how many tombstones they stole. I don't know how long they did it for. But that's a wild plan. Then he started smuggling radio equipment and stealing cars, which led to his first arrest in 1974. Then after that whole little shenanigans, he started working for a smuggler. And by the time he was 22 years old, he had earned his first $1 million. When he was 23 years old, he met a girl. And I'm saying a girl because she was a girl. She was 12. Her name was Maria Victoria Hanau, and she was really into him, even though he was like 11 years older than her. A grown man. He was a grown man. She was a little girl, but she thought that he was sweet and affectionate and a gentleman. And he apparently thought the same of her, sweet, affectionate gentleman. I'm just kidding. But he did work hard to win her heart. He liked her and he would give her gifts. He gave her this yellow bike one time. He would serenade her with romantic ballads, which is making my eye twitch just thinking about it. I would hate that. If you want to make me cringe and die, serenade me. So Victoria knew that he was her Prince Charming, but she was still so young. And when he kissed her, she would just completely become paralyzed with fear because she was a little girl. So she didn't have a proper grasp on intimacy and what that sort of intense contact meant. And what happened next is something that she didn't really realize and understand until later. And she would hold this secret in for like 25 years before she talked about it. But Pablo raped her. And 3 weeks later, she started to feel weird, but it never occurred to her that she was pregnant. She was only 14. And Pablo, who's 25 now at the time, obviously knew very well what was happening and going on. And so I think Pablo Escobar was a very charming, smooth talker. And he came over to visit her and asked how she was feeling and asked if she would come with him to this woman's house. And so Victoria trusts and loves Pablo. And so she goes with him to this lady's house, and it's in this remote and desolate area. And when they got there, Victoria was told to lay down on a stretcher, and this older woman immediately inserted several plastic tubes up into her womb and told her that they would serve as prevention that she could be pregnant. And then she was sent on her way, and she was instructed to take the tubes out once she started to bleed. And poor Victoria doesn't know what's happening. She's just listening to these adults, doing what she's told. She's in agonizing pain, but she had no choice but to just grin and bear it. Go to school, hide what was happening. She had 8 siblings, her parents. She lived at, she was a kid. She lived at home. And so she just had to deal with it herself. She couldn't really confide in anybody. So, like I said, it took her years to realize that she was raped, impregnated, and forced into an abortion. And that, I'm sure, is traumatic for the soul. But she was still so young. She was still naive. And even after this experience, she was super infatuated with Pablo. And she was willing to defy her parents and run away and marry him. And so that's what she did. On March 29th of 1976, Pablo and Victoria secretly got married in Santissima Trinidad Church in Palmyra in front of Victoria's grandmother and her aunt. And that night, Pablo whisked her off her feet and carried her across a patio that was covered in flowers into a room that she called the Nook, where they consummated their marriage. And she said, quote, "It was a night of unforgettable love that remains tattooed on my skin as one of the happiest moments of my life. I wanted time to stand still for the intimacy we were enjoying to last forever," end quote. She's very infatuated with her husband. So after this, Victoria settled into her new life as a housewife and a high school student. And within weeks of their marriage, she was pregnant again. She continued to go to school, and even while she was wildly pregnant, due any second, she kept going to school. And she had some signs of labor one morning, but she's like, I can't miss my English test. And so she went to school, and as she's taking this test, her water breaks. And she made it to the hospital just half an hour before their son Juan Pablo came into the world. 7 years later, their daughter Manuela was born. Victoria says that she was pretty naive to what was going on with Pablo and what he was doing to bring in loads of money. So she's at home with her kids, and then there's Pablo. He's starting drug cartels and whatnot. In the mid-70s, he and the Ochoa Vasquez brothers founded the Medellin cartel. The original cartel members were Jorge Luis, Fabio, and Juan David. And then there was also Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha and Carlos later. The way the cartel kind of functioned at first was the Ochoa brothers were the brains of the operation, and Pablo oversaw the group's protection. But this was just at first, because Pablo, we know, he grew to become this king boss of cocaine. He began to oversee the import of large 15-ton shipments of coca base from Peru and Bolivia into Colombia. And then once they got to Colombia, they would be processed into cocaine in these jungle labs. And then their enterprise would store the cocaine and then fly it to the U.S. And the way, oh my gosh, the way that people would smuggle drugs, they would have people swallow bags of cocaine to smuggle it into the U.S. That's, I mean, how desperate do you have to be? And what place in your life do you have to be swallowing huge bags of cocaine and risking death? It's so sad. Not too long after they started this whole thing, the Medellin cartel dominated the cocaine trade. It's estimated that they supplied 80% of the cocaine trade to the U.S., and as the cartel's rising leader, Pablo Escobar was nearly untouchable. Now, let's remember cocaine. I don't know how prominent it is now. I mean, it circulates, but remember back in the 80s how it seemed like everybody was doing cocaine because nobody really understood how bad cocaine is for you. So I'm sure I don't know. I don't know the numbers. I'm just assuming it was probably, there's a lot of cocaine going in and out. By the 1980s and into the 90s, Pablo had complete control over the cocaine supply. In the mid-80s, he founded a criminal debt collection service known as the Oficina de Envigado. He would use the municipal office to collect debts owed to him by drug traffickers through sicarios, which are hitmen, if they refuse to pay up. And at this point, Pablo Escobar was so freaking filthy rich that he didn't even know how to spend his money. He lived a very lavish lifestyle, yet he still had more money than he knew what to do with. He made, at his high point, he made an estimated $420 million per week. Per week. $420 million per week. He was worth $25 billion. And because they weren't always able to launder the cash quickly enough, it was often stashed in walls and warehouses and other hiding places. And he made so much money that every year the cartel would just write 10% of it off because, things happen to money, to physical money, if you're storing it like that. There's rats who would eat it while it was in storage. It would get damaged by water, or it would just get lost. And so, no biggie, just write off 10%. Just write off 10% of all that money. But, this isn't a big deal for a guy like Pablo Escobar. He would spend $2,500 a month just on rubber bands to hold his stacks together. Never have I ever. With all this money, he had a multi-million-dollar estate built. It was known as Hacienda Napoles, and it was on 7,000 acres, about 93 miles east of Medellin. And the home itself was this sprawling Spanish colonial mansion. And on the property, he had a soccer field, a sculpture garden. I want a sculpture garden. Even if I'm never going to be a billionaire, I still want a sculpture garden. He had several pools. There were man-made lakes. There was a bull ring. There was a racetrack for go-karts, an airfield. He had private jets. He had a tennis court, and even a private zoo that had elephants and rhinos and hippos and exotic birds. But despite this opulent lifestyle, Pablo presented himself as a populist figure, and he earned the nickname Robin Hood due to his charitable deeds, and that helped him gain notoriety. So he very much had two sides. But his dark ate up all his light. We know how the story goes. But the good things he did, he constructed clinics, sports arenas, low-income housing. Remember, he came from a lower-income family. That's what he was raised with. And so he bonded with these people. And he loved soccer. He supported the neighborhood soccer clubs. But then back to the mischievous, sinful side with zero moral compass. On his property, he also had an apartment made. It was camouflaged behind the stables. It was close to the main house, and that's where he'd take his mistresses. He was knocking boots all over the place. And Victoria, his wife, just chose not to ask questions. She chose not to track him or to check his shirts for lipstick because she knew what was going on, but she wasn't prepared to verify that and know the answers for sure. And so she just kind of turned a blind eye and suffered. She would wait up all night for him and just cry, and just a miserable life. There was one night that Pablo and Victoria were over at a friend's farm for a dinner party, and the power went out. And so the party's left in darkness, and Victoria just continued the conversation she was having with friends by candlelight, but Pablo had disappeared. And as it turns out, Pablo had asked the host to cut the power so that he could go be with one of his mistresses who was waiting in one of the bedrooms. This was such a big part of his life that he ended up getting a penthouse with an ice rink and a bowling alley where he could do all his womanizing in peace, I guess. In this penthouse, he installed hidden cameras in all the bathrooms and bedrooms so that he could spy on the women that he brought back there. And he had a secret room, and he and his driver would lock themselves in there after the women were gone and watch the footage back. So Pablo's out gallivanting, doing crimes and mistresses, and his wife is back home taking care of the kids in the house and knowing he's having these affairs and knowing her life sucks and crying herself to sleep, all just always waiting for him to come home, which was always after the sun came up. He always came home. That's the thing. He liked to be in his bed when he went to sleep, but he'd be out all night. One particular mistress of Pablo's was a woman named Wendy. She was 28 years old. She was 6 feet tall. She had green eyes, dark hair, and their affair lasted for several years. And this one hurt Victoria the most because she knew that her husband seemed to really have fallen for this lady. And so Victoria's like, I'm leaving. I'm sure in her mind, she's like, all these other women, they're just his toys, but he really loves her, and that hurts my soul, I guess. So she's like, I'm leaving. But then he turned on his charm and sweet talked her into sticking around. But the affair didn't end right away. It only ended when Wendy got pregnant and he forced her to have an abortion. He's like, how dare you get pregnant on my watch? How dare you have this unapproved pregnancy? Go get an abortion. So that was the end of their affair, and Wendy went on to have this fling with Pablo's hitman. His name was John Velasquez. They called him Popeye. As it turns out, Wendy was also an informant. And so one night while she was laying in bed with John, the phone rang. So John picks it up and goes into the other room, and a recording of her evidence to the DEA was played. After the recording ended, Pablo came on and said, "You or her, love or death." So John walked back into the bedroom and shot Wendy in the head twice. Killed her instantly. Didn't think twice about it. And that was that. Pablo's way of handling problems was plata o plomo, meaning silver or lead, meaning bribes or bullets. It's reported that Pablo killed around 4,000 people. And of those were an estimated 200 judges, 1,000 police, journalists, and government officials. But they were never really by him, by his hand personally. These were people who were so loyal to him. Between all the money and his charm, he just had lots of people working for him. He would offer his hitmen a $700 bonus for each police officer that they assassinated. There was one time that he was having a party at his house, and a waiter who was working there was caught stealing silverware. And so in retaliation, he had the employee tied up and drowned in his swimming pool while his guests watched. Luis Carlos Galan was a Colombian politician who spoke freely and publicly against the Medellin cartel. Despite threats against him and his kids, he would get death threats, and they would threaten to kidnap and kill his kids. Are you kidding me? This man was brave. And one day when he walked onto a stage to give a speech in front of 10,000 people, he was shot and killed in front of all those people. There were some others that were injured. I think they're okay in the end, but I think everybody's probably pretty scarred from that. A young man named Alberto Prieto, who was working for Pablo, was told that he should board the Avianca Flight 203. And once the plane was airborne, he was to turn on this recording device to catch the conversation of a couple of nearby passengers. And unbeknownst to Alberto, they lied to him. The recording device was actually a bomb, and once he unknowingly set it off, all 107 people on board, including himself, were killed in the blast, and 3 more people on the ground were killed as well because they were hit by falling debris. This was all Pablo's attempt to kill a presidential candidate named Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, but he wasn't on board, and he did end up becoming the president of Colombia. Among those killed on the plane were 2 Americans, which prompted the Bush administration to begin intelligence support activity operations to find Pablo. But then tragedy struck again at the hands of Pablo Escobar. 9 days after that plane bombing, a truck was parked near the Administrative Department of Security, and it exploded. And it instantly killed 57 people and injured over 2,200. Then on April 30th, 1984, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a Colombian lawyer and politician, was in his Mercedes-Benz when a few men on motorcycles pulled up next to him in his caravan, and one of them shot him with an Uzi. Rodrigo was responsible for incarcerating members of the Medellin cartel, and Pablo didn't like it, so he had him killed. A warrant for Pablo's arrest was issued, and the U.S. government sought to have him extradited. Pablo became the target of a large manhunt, and for 7 years he stayed on the run. After 7 years, the government started to negotiate his surrender. Pablo allegedly said, quote, "I would rather have a grave in Colombia than a jail cell in the U.S." So he agreed to serve a 5-year sentence if he could build his own prison. So on a mountaintop, Pablo had the cathedral constructed. It had a sauna. I think its nickname was Hotel Escobar or something like that, because it was like a spa. He had a sauna, a waterfall, soccer fields, can't forget the soccer fields, had a casino, a nightclub, and even a compound for his family to stay in. And authorities were not allowed within 3 miles of it. Oh my gosh. So the government's so desperate that they're like, okay, yeah, you can live in a spa. So this arrangement lasted for just over a year, but then it fell apart because authorities learned that Pablo had 4 of his lieutenants tortured and murdered within the cathedral. Some of Pablo's men found a stash of $20 million on a property that belonged to a cartel member named Fernando Galeano. And so Pablo summoned Galeano and another associate, Gerardo Moncada, for a meeting at the cathedral. And when they got there, they were killed by 2 of Pablo's sicarios. Before they could put him into a standard prison, he caught wind of what was happening and that the authorities knew, and so he made a daring escape by walking out the back door. So Pablo and his family were on the run again, and you know, Pablo was a family man. He was a terrible, murderous, vicious drug lord, but he was a family man. In fact, while they were in hiding, his daughter was cold, and so he pulled out $2 million cash and set it on fire so that she could be warm. I'm not joking, he really did that. It's a $2 million fire. So really, you can't complain about your heating bill. Just kidding, you should complain about it. So for weeks, his family was hiding in fear. And so finally, Pablo just told Victoria that she and the children were moving to a safe house under government protection. He was a family man, you know? He had unconditional love for his family. And so they had to make their goodbyes. And Victoria was devastated because even though Pablo was a terrible person, she loved him. And so it was this heart-wrenching goodbye. He cried and cried and cried while he kissed and hugged his kids goodbye. 2 organizations began the search for Escobar. One was a U.S.-trained Colombian task force called Search Block, and the other one was a group known as Los Pepes, Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, which means persecuted by Pablo Escobar. And that group was made up of family members of Escobar's victims and men from a rival Colombian drug cartel. So they're all after Pablo Escobar. And it wouldn't take long till they got him. On Pablo's 44th birthday in 1993, he ate cake, he ate wine, he ate marijuana, and then the next day, he was traced through a call he made to his son. His time, I mean, I'm surprised he made it 44 years, to be honest with you. I don't think anybody could pull that off these days. But they traced him, so 16 months. Now, it's been 16 months since he escaped the cathedral. Pablo knew that this was it, and he hopped up onto the rooftop where he was, and he hopped across the barrio rooftops, and he's trying to evade officials, and it's just not going to happen for him because they're literally chasing him on rooftops. Where is he going to go? He was shot in the leg and in the torso, and then the final fatal shot was through the ear. And we don't know for sure what happened because we weren't there. And his son claimed in his book, he wrote a book, he claimed that his dad repeatedly warned him that in order to avoid being taken alive, he would shoot himself in the right ear. So we don't know if they got him or if he got himself. Either way, he was dead. It was a deadly shootout, and Pablo Escobar is gone. And there's a picture of him, of his dead, bloody body, laying on this rooftop with these guys smiling around him, the guys that were trying to get him. I'm going to post it on my website if you want to see it. It's a little bit graphic, fair warning. But they got him. And so this guy who just, oh my gosh, wreaked so much havoc and death and violence on Colombia was finally gone. And Colombia's crime rate came way down after Pablo Escobar was dead. So after his death, his wife and kids they had to deal with the troubles he's caused forever. They're still dealing with it. No country, they're trying to escape Colombia, and no country would grant them asylum. And the Cali cartel was demanding millions of dollars in reparations for Pablo's crimes against them from his family. So they're dealing with that. They're trying to find refuge. They went to Brazil, Ecuador, South Africa, to Peru, and they finally were able to settle into Argentina under assumed names. But 4 or 5 years later, after being there, Victoria and Juan Pablo were arrested for falsifying a public document, money laundering, and illicit association. So they were taken to jail for a few months, but ultimately they were released because there just wasn't enough evidence to convict them. So Victoria is 61 years old now. She wrote a book called Pablo and Me, My Life with Escobar. Their son, Juan Pablo, changed his name to Sebastian Marroquin in an attempt to distance himself from the family legacy. They'll always be known as Pablo Escobar's kids to whoever knows that they're his kids. He also wrote a book. It's called Pablo Escobar, My Father. And he acknowledges his father's love. He understands and recognizes that his father really loved them. But he knows that he wasn't a good person. And he doesn't pretend he was. He recently spoke out denouncing the glorification of Pablo Escobar because he is glorified. Think of somebody you hate who's done you so wrong and pretend like people glorify them and are super fascinated and want to know all about them. That would suck. And so I imagine that's how his family feels. And then Manuela, little sis, she dipped out from the spotlight in the 90s. She didn't want any part of any of it, and she has struggled a lot with her mental health. And in fact, she even has tried to take her own life. I don't know if it's been multiple times, but at least once she has. And so she lives with her brother and his wife, and just for her safety. And but she lives in constant fear of being discovered. She's paranoid. She's afraid that someday her loved ones are going to be taken or killed or have to pay for what her dad did. Why are we so fascinated with Pablo Escobar? I know he's a terrible person. He's awful. But oh my gosh, there's movies and shows and books and all sorts of things. So much information out there about Pablo Escobar. And it's so fascinating to me. And I think it's because he lived a life that's completely opposite of my life and the life that I've been taught and chosen to live, as well as most people, I think. Just, he had zero moral compass. And I think most of us, and he wasn't, like, when you think of people who do horrible things like this, they're usually psychotic, sociopathic, they have some crazy mental disorder. But he didn't. Like, he was capable of love. He loved his family so much. He had unconditional love for them. But then he would go and shoot somebody in the face. It just is so wild to me. Thank you for being here and listening. If you could leave me a 5-star review, that'd be great. If you want to check out my Instagram, it's The Story of Pod. Thank you for being here. Have a great week. Love you. Bye.